Welcome to Founding Chronicles. Before we dive into today's story, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss our historical deep dives. Quick question: where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments below. Now let's step back to Baton Rouge, 1856, and uncover the chilling tale of Margaret, the enslaved woman who struck deadly revenge against her master's sons. In the humid, sweltering air of Baton Rouge in the mid-1850s, the Beaumont Plantation stretched like a fortress of wealth and power across miles of cane fields, its whitewashed walls gleaming under the southern sun. The mansion itself seemed to breathe the pride of generations, a testament to the fortunes carved from sugar, land, and the labor of enslaved people whose names were largely erased from history. Among these silent witnesses to opulence and cruelty was Margaret, a woman whose life had been shaped by the very forces that enslaved her, yet whose mind and heart burned with a determination that would one day rewrite the history of this plantation in blood and fear. Margaret had arrived at the Beaumont house years earlier as a girl, sold to the family after losing her own children to the same merciless system that now held her captive. Her heart carried the hollow ache of motherhood ripped from her arms, a wound that would never truly heal. Each night, as she lay on the straw mat in the servants' quarters, she listened to the laughter of the Beaumont children echoing through the halls, a cruel reminder of what had been stolen from her. She learned every pattern, every routine, every hidden corridor of the sprawling estate. The kitchen became her sanctuary, the place where she could wield a power that was invisible yet absolute. Among pots, spoons, and simmering sugar syrup, she studied the plants and herbs that grew in small patches behind the servants' quarters, her fingers tracing the textures and colors, her mind storing the knowledge that would later become her weapon. Oleander, foxglove, hemlock, and coral beans, each plant whispered a promise of subtle, undetectable vengeance if wielded with care. Her hands, accustomed to kneading dough and scrubbing floors, became instruments of quiet destruction. The Beaumont sons, oblivious to the tension that simmered beneath the surface of their gilded existence, moved through their privileged lives, with the careless arrogance of boys who believed the world had been built for them alone. The eldest, Thomas, was ruthless in his authority over the enslaved children, echoing the harshness of their father. The middle son, William, was cruel in smaller, quieter ways, taking twisted pleasure in humiliations and minor tortures. And the youngest, Henry, was reckless, his youthful curiosity often landing him in danger. But to Margaret, all three represented the same thing: the faces of the men who had stolen her children, the heirs of a family whose wealth had been purchased at the expense of countless lives. At night, when the plantation lay in silence, she would sit by the candlelight, her hands busy with herbs, powders, and subtle mixtures. She remembered the sharp, biting taste of her own grief, the bitter lessons she had learned about survival, and she began to plot with the patience of a scholar and the determination of a mother seeking justice. Margaret's first act of vengeance was not sudden. It was a long, deliberate process of observation. She learned the sleeping habits of the boys, the sounds they made, the way the night watch of the household operated. Nothing escaped her attention: the creak of floorboards, the scent of the night air drifting in through open windows, the rhythm of footsteps on stairs. Every detail became a thread in the tapestry she wove, a plan that required the precision of a surgeon. Her first victim would be Thomas, the eldest, whose arrogance had made him the most dangerous to her and to those around him. She prepared a simple dinner one evening, embedding within it the first trace of her botanical knowledge, a carefully measured amount of foxglove that would slow the heart in imperceptible stages. That night, as Thomas lay in bed, he complained of a sudden weariness, attributing it to the heat, or perhaps some imagined ailment. By morning, he was dead, his body calm and pale, the cause of death a mystery to all but Margaret, who had watched. over him with a quiet, almost maternal gaze. She did not celebrate. There was no triumph in the act, only the cold satisfaction that justice, measured in her own terms, had been delivered. The household was thrown into a controlled panic. Whispers of illness and misfortune spread like wildfire, yet no one suspected Margaret. She continued her daily tasks, smiling when called upon, scrubbing floors, tending fires, carrying water, all while the memory of her own children sharpened her resolve. The second son, William, fell into her carefully laid snare weeks later. She experimented with a different combination of herbs and poisons, using the subtle chemistry she had studied in secrecy. He complained of stomach pains, a mild fever, and fatigue, but to the household it appeared as if some sudden, inexplicable illness had taken hold. Margaret moved among the household with unassuming grace, ensuring that she was always present, always helpful, always invisible. Each day that passed reinforced the invisibility her position afforded her. The trust that the family had unwittingly bestowed upon her became her shield, and her silent vengeance became an instrument of terror beyond anyone's understanding. By the time she reached Henry, the youngest, Margaret had become methodical in her work, her confidence strengthened by the success of her prior acts. The household, now gripped by fear and suspicion, looked for causes outside the walls, unable to conceive that the gentle, obedient nursemaid, the woman who had been with the family for years, could wield such calculated destruction. Henry's death was swift, a final act of retribution that completed her cycle of revenge against the men who represented the theft of her children and the cruelty of the system that had broken her. Margaret did not flee, did not gloat. She remained within the household, a quiet observer, as the Beaumont family's grief became the pulse of the plantation. Those who had underestimated her learned too late that the invisible hands of servitude could deliver the deadliest blows. Margaret's story, however, did not end with these murders. The knowledge she had amassed, the secret understanding of poisons, plants, and the rhythm of plantation life, gave her a power that extended beyond personal revenge. When the Beaumont funeral brought together the elite of Baton Rouge, Margaret saw an opportunity that went beyond her grief. She prepared dishes with coral bean and other subtle botanical agents, delivering them to the gathering as a trusted servant. The resulting deaths were swift, shocking, and inexplicable to the broader public. 17 prominent figures perished, and the city of Baton Rouge was thrown into panic. No one suspected the quiet, obedient Margaret, whose smile remained unshaken, whose hands continued to serve and clean. The lesson she imparted was unspoken, yet clear. Those rendered invisible could strike with precision, transforming despair into action. Margaret's acts became legend in whispered tales among enslaved communities, her methods shared in secret, replicated in subtle ways that defied the understanding of plantation owners. She became more than a woman. She became a symbol of resistance, an embodiment of the hidden strength of those whom the system sought to suppress. Her story reached beyond Baton Rouge, teaching others that the tools of the kitchen and garden could become instruments of survival and defiance. And though the manhunt for her became relentless, Margaret had already transcended the confines of her own identity, leaving a legacy that would haunt the living and resonate in the abandoned halls of the Beaumont mansion for generations to come. Even today, visitors who wander the grounds of the old plantation speak of strange scents carried on the wind, the aroma of herbs that should not grow in that soil, and the faint whisper of footsteps that vanish as quickly as they appear. These are the remnants of Margaret's presence, a testament to the power of a woman who turned grief into strategy, invisibility into terror, and a stolen motherhood into a legacy that refused to die. History may have recorded her name only in fragments, but the shadow she cast over Baton Rouge and the lessons she imparted remain vivid, a reminder that the most profound resistance often comes from the most unassuming places. The aftermath of the Beaumont children's deaths left the plantation in a state of fragile shock. The grandeur of the mansion, once a symbol of wealth and invincibility, now seemed hollow, its white walls echoing with whispers of grief and suspicion. The surviving members of the family moved like ghosts through the halls, their eyes haunted by fear that the next calamity might strike without warning. Margaret remained as ever, a figure of quiet composure, tending the fires, carrying baskets of food, and ensuring the house ran with the efficiency that only long experience could produce. Yet beneath the calm exterior, her mind was sharpening, plotting and refining. She understood the psychology of fear, how it spread, how it paralyzed, and how it could be wielded as effectively as any herb or powder. Word of the deaths traveled beyond the walls of Baton Rouge, reaching the ears of other planter families who prided themselves on their knowledge of the enslaved people in their employ. They speculated wildly about illness, accidents, even divine retribution, yet none could conceive that the perpetrator might be someone they had trusted for years, someone who had held their children in her arms and fed them at the table. To Margaret, this ignorance was her greatest ally. She moved among them with a grace and humility that belied the storm of intellect and vengeance raging within her. Her reputation among the enslaved community, however, was quietly growing. Whispers of her actions, shared in hushed tones by those who had long endured the cruelties of plantation life, spread like fire. She became a figure of awe, a legend whispered from one kitchen to another, from one field to the next, teaching others that the tools of domestic labor, pots, spoons, herbs, and careful observation, could be instruments of resistance. The Beaumont funeral, intended as a ceremony of mourning and solidarity among the elite of Baton Rouge, became the stage for Margaret's next calculated move. 17 of the city's most prominent figures, gathered in the grand dining hall, were swept into her carefully orchestrated plan. She prepared dishes with an artistry that only someone intimately familiar with the family's tastes and habits could achieve. Each dessert, each delicately seasoned morsel, carried within it a measured dose of coral bean and other botanical toxins she had mastered over years of quiet study. When the plates were served, the guests were none the wiser, laughing, drinking, and toasting to family and fortune. By the end of the night, 17 of them lay dead, their deaths swift, inexplicable, and horrifyingly precise. Panic swept through Baton Rouge like wildfire. Rumors of poisoning spread, and an air of paranoia descended upon the planter class. Yet Margaret remained among the living, her presence unnoticed, her movements indistinguishable from the care and diligence she had always displayed. This act transformed her from a figure of personal vengeance into a symbol of systemic defiance. To those who had been enslaved, her methods offered a roadmap, an example that knowledge, patience, and cunning could be more powerful than brute force. Margaret's influence extended beyond the confines of the Beaumont plantation. Word of her skills, her courage, and her audacity traveled along the Underground Railroad and through networks of enslaved communities, inspiring others to find subtle, inventive ways to resist. Each story shared in secret gardens, behind the cover of night, or in whispered conversation in the fields, was a thread in a tapestry of quiet revolution. Margaret had become both teacher and myth, demonstrating that the house and kitchen that had been instruments of subjugation could be transformed into spaces of power and liberation. Despite the reach of her actions, the investigation that followed was chaotic and disoriented. The local authorities and the families affected could not comprehend the possibility that an enslaved woman could orchestrate such devastatingly sophisticated attacks. Their assumptions about intelligence, capability, and loyalty blinded them to the reality that the system itself had created the tools of its undoing. Margaret exploited this blindness, using it as both shield and weapon. She had learned to read the patterns of the household and the city, understanding how fear would spread, how trust could be manipulated, and how her invisibility was her greatest strength. Margaret's careful planning extended even to her personal movements. She observed the investigators, noting their routines, listening to their conversations, and subtly guiding their suspicions away from herself. She understood that power often lay not in action, but in perception. By remaining calm, diligent, and obedient, she became a mirror of the expectations placed upon her, allowing the panic and chaos to swirl around her like a storm that could not touch her. The contrast between her outward behavior and the consequences of her actions created a tension that made her legend all the more compelling among the enslaved population and all the more terrifying to the planter elite. Her methods of botanical vengeance became increasingly refined over time. She studied the timing, combinations, and subtle properties of various plants, experimenting with dosages that would create confusion, illness, or sudden death without leaving traceable evidence. She combined the study of herbs with her intimate understanding of domestic routines, transforming every kitchen task, every meal prepared, into an opportunity for strategic action. Margaret's life became a meticulous balance between invisibility and omnipresence, between service and surveillance, between grief and calculated resolve. As word of her acts spread beyond Baton Rouge, it began to unsettle the social order of the region. Plantation owners grew suspicious of their own households, doubting even the most trusted servants, fearing that any act of obedience could conceal an ulterior motive. The terror she instilled was both psychological and practical. No family felt entirely safe within the walls of their homes, and every meal carried the potential for mortality. Margaret's mastery of fear and patience demonstrated a truth that the slave system had tried to suppress. Those it sought to render invisible could, and would, find ways to fight back. Yet Margaret herself was not immune to the weight of her actions. Each life taken, each calculated act of vengeance, carried with it the burden of moral complexity and the echo of personal grief. She mourned her own children, whose faces haunted her nights, and yet she understood that her path of retribution had grown beyond personal revenge. It had become a statement, a demonstration that knowledge, courage, and patience could overcome brutality and oppression. Her eyes, steady and calculating, often lingered on the windows of the plantation at night, gazing at the stars above the cane fields, and for a moment the heavy weight of loss and the taste of justice mingled in her heart. Margaret's story was now inseparable from the history of Baton Rouge itself. Families who had once laughed in the halls of grandeur now whispered in fear, and communities of enslaved people saw in her a figure of possibility, a demonstration that resistance could take many forms, that the invisible could strike with precision, and that knowledge and patience were as powerful as the lash or the whip. She had transformed grief into strategy, invisibility into influence, and pain into action. And though the authorities hunted her tirelessly, she had already moved beyond their grasp, becoming not just a woman, but a legend, a teacher, and a force that could not be contained. The haunting of the Beaumont mansion became more than metaphorical. Visitors years later spoke of the lingering scents of exotic herbs, of rooms that seemed to carry the memory of unseen hands at work, and of a presence that was more than human, a reminder of the calculated, unyielding intellect of the woman, who had walked their halls unnoticed, yet whose legacy had reshaped lives and shattered illusions. Margaret's influence spread quietly, in gardens and kitchens, in whispered instructions and careful demonstrations, leaving behind lessons that would be carried for generations. The tools of daily life, spoons, bowls, herbs, became symbols of resistance, and the boundaries of power and control were redrawn, invisibly but indelibly, by the mind and courage of one woman. As the city of Baton Rouge reeled from the shock waves of Margaret's deadly precision, her legend grew beyond the plantation walls. Families once confident in the order and security of their estates now moved through their homes with suspicion and unease. Every servant, no matter how trusted, became a subject of scrutiny. Margaret had introduced a new kind of fear into the hearts of the planter class. Fear not born of rebellion in the streets or open confrontation, but of quiet, unseen, and almost unimaginable power. The realization that one enslaved woman, underestimated, and rendered invisible by a system built on her subjugation, could manipulate death with such exactitude was a revelation that unsettled the very foundation of their society. No amount of wealth, no display of power, could shield them from what they could not see. Yet for Margaret, the aftermath of her actions was a complex tapestry of triumph and sorrow. The satisfaction of vengeance was tempered by the memory of her stolen children, the lives that could never be reclaimed, and the countless others who remained shackled by the same cruelty that had shaped her own resolve. Each evening, as she worked quietly in the kitchens, preparing the meals that would nourish the living while she remembered the dead, she felt the weight of responsibility settle into her bones. Her knowledge was both weapon and burden, and she carried it with a deliberate grace, understanding that her actions had set into motion a wave of change that could not be contained. She had become a teacher, whether she intended it or not, showing that patience, observation, and intelligence could transform grief and oppression into strategy and survival. The ripple effects of Margaret's deeds extended far beyond Baton Rouge. Across the Deep South, enslaved communities heard of her precision, her courage, and her ingenuity. Whispers of her acts traveled in secret channels, carried by those who understood that knowledge was as vital a tool as a blade. Margaret's methods, poisons derived from common garden plants, meticulous observation of routines, the careful calibration of meals, became lessons in survival and subtle resistance. She had demonstrated that rebellion need not be loud to be devastating, that the most trusted and overlooked individuals could wield power beyond the imagination of their oppressors. In kitchens and gardens, hidden behind the walls of plantation houses, these lessons were quietly taught, shared, and sometimes replicated, spreading a culture of resistance that was invisible to the very people who had thought themselves untouchable. Meanwhile, the planter class of Baton Rouge was caught in a spiral of fear and suspicion. They consulted doctors, botanists, and chemists, searching for explanations in poisons, diseases, or even divine judgment. Yet none could fully grasp the reality. The threat had come from a place they considered safe, from a woman whose presence had been normalized and trusted. The psychological toll on the elite families was immense. Their certainty of control had been shattered, leaving them anxious, paranoid, and vulnerable. Every servant was now a potential threat, every meal a potential weapon. Margaret had not merely exacted revenge. She had fundamentally altered the perception of power in her society. The invisible, once assumed powerless, could now command fear, influence outcomes, and challenge the structures that had seemed unassailable. Margaret herself remained an enigma to all who encountered her. She moved among the living with the same quiet, diligent grace that had defined her for years, yet every glance, every gesture, carried the weight of knowledge and purpose. Her eyes, steady and discerning, could read a person in an instant, detecting fear, arrogance, or curiosity. And she used this understanding to manipulate perception without ever drawing suspicion to herself. To the family, she remained the devoted servant, the woman who had fed and cared for their children, scrubbed their floors, and kept the household running with tireless efficiency. To the enslaved community, she was a figure of reverence, a symbol of what could be achieved through intellect, patience, and courage in the face of systemic brutality. In time, the story of Margaret became a cautionary tale and an inspiration, depending on who told it. Among the elites, she was a ghost, a whisper of terror whose actions defied logic and reason. Among the oppressed, she was a hero, a teacher, and a symbol of ingenuity in the face of impossible odds. Her methods, refined and precise, spread subtly through the South, influencing acts of quiet defiance, teaching enslaved people that the kitchen and garden could be tools of liberation as much as the fields were sites of labor. Margaret's influence became a shadow that extended far beyond her physical presence, a reminder that knowledge and courage could transform the powerless into architects of their own destiny. The impact of Margaret's work on Baton Rouge society was profound and enduring. Plantation owners became increasingly rigid in their control, imposing stricter rules, demanding more oversight, and punishing even minor acts of disobedience with severity. Yet, in doing so, they reinforced the very lesson Margaret had imparted, that the tools of oppression could be turned against them. Every added restriction, every layer of surveillance, only highlighted the vulnerability they had long ignored. Margaret had shown that the mind of one determined individual could outpace the machinery of wealth and authority, and that invisibility was a weapon more potent than brute force. Her story, however, was not solely defined by death and fear. It was also a story of resilience, of intellect, and of the unbreakable human spirit. Margaret's careful study of herbs, poisons, and the patterns of daily life was not born of cruelty alone. It was born of necessity, of grief, and of a desire to reclaim agency in a world designed to strip her of it. Each act of precision, each calculated move, was both a message and a means of survival, a testament to the power of knowledge wielded with purpose. In teaching others, whether directly or through the mere example of her ingenuity, she transformed her pain into a form of empowerment that extended beyond her own circumstances. Even as she navigated the dangers of pursuit by authorities, Margaret's calm and calculated demeanor allowed her to evade capture. Her movements became a dance of patience and foresight, ensuring that every action was deliberate and every trace she left could not lead back to her. She understood that her survival depended not just on skill, but on perception, on the careful management of how others saw her. In this way, she turned invisibility into a form of armor, allowing her to continue her work, to continue teaching, and to continue existing as a force that both terrified and inspired. And so Margaret's legend continued to grow, a story whispered in kitchens, fields, and secret gatherings. She became a symbol of the hidden power of the enslaved, a living lesson that knowledge, patience, and courage could overturn the assumptions of an entire social system. Her impact was psychological, practical, and deeply emotional. She had shown that grief could be transformed into action, that invisibility could become influence, and that even the most oppressed could find ways to strike with precision and purpose. The very system that sought to render her powerless had become the stage upon which she demonstrated her mastery, turning tools of service into instruments of strategy and sorrow into a weapon that reshaped the world around her. Even decades later, the memory of Margaret lingered. In Baton Rouge, the abandoned halls of the Beaumont mansion carried the echoes of her presence, the faint scents of herbs that seemed to grow from nowhere, and the whisper of footsteps that belonged to no living person. For those who understood the story, these remnants were more than superstition. They were reminders of a woman who had turned grief, knowledge, and invisibility into a force that could not be ignored, a figure who had transcended her circumstances to teach lessons that would haunt and inspire for generations. As the years passed, Margaret's presence, or at least the memory of it, grew more formidable than any chains or patrols could suppress. Baton Rouge had not forgotten the terror she had sown, nor the unsettling knowledge that one mind, honed by grief and determination, could unravel the foundations of wealth, authority, and complacency. The Beaumont mansion, once a sanctuary of lineage and pride, now stood as a monument to both fear and invisibility, a place haunted by the cunning intellect of a woman who had moved unseen through the corridors of power. Each room, each kitchen, seemed to carry her invisible touch, the lingering scent of herbs, the faint residue of knowledge too potent to be erased, and the memory of hands that had prepared meals that could kill as easily as they could nourish. Margaret herself became a phantom, moving through the lives of those who survived her campaign as though she were untouchable. Her figure was rarely seen in the daylight, and when glimpsed, it blended seamlessly into the ordinary labor of the plantation. Yet her reputation grew beyond mere anecdote. It became legend, a force that shaped the consciousness of both enslaved and free communities alike. Among the enslaved, Margaret's story was told as a parable of empowerment, a lesson in strategy, patience, and courage. She was revered not just as a woman who had avenged the loss of her children, but as someone who had demonstrated that intellect and observation could triumph where brute force failed. Children whispered her name in awe, adults discussed her deeds in hushed tones, and her methods, replicated in secret, spread from one plantation to another. For the planter class, the fear persisted and evolved. They could not comprehend that the most trusted individuals in their employ, those who fed, clothed, and nurtured their children, could also be their most formidable adversaries. Every gesture of obedience was now viewed with suspicion. Every meal, every whisper of movement in the halls was scrutinized for hidden threats. Margaret had shifted the balance of power subtly, invisibly, but irrevocably. The fear she inspired was psychological, social, and practical. It became embedded in the routines of Baton Rouge households, shaping behavior and decisions in ways that reinforced the lesson she had taught, that power need not always be visible to be absolute. Yet even as she eluded capture, Margaret's story remained incomplete. No official record could fully encapsulate her genius, her grief, or her calculated vengeance. Investigators, medical professionals, and city officials were left confounded, unable to understand how one woman, hidden in plain sight, had achieved what seemed impossible. And perhaps this was Margaret's final triumph, to operate beyond the understanding of those who sought to control and define her, to remain a figure of both reality and myth. The search for her became legendary, with reports of sightings, stories, of sudden illnesses, and whispers of her continuing presence circulating through Baton Rouge and beyond. But she had already transcended the need for physical recognition. Her influence, her methodology, and her daring intellect had embedded themselves into the very fabric of resistance, ensuring that even in absence, she remained present. Margaret's acts were not merely the product of vengeance. They were a study in the conversion of grief into action. Each death, each calculated poisoning, had been an expression of the stolen years, the ripped-apart families, and the injustices of a system that had dehumanized her. Yet in every act, there was precision, restraint, and the discipline of someone who understood that true power lay in the invisible, the methodical, and the patient. She had turned the spaces intended to confine her, the kitchen, the garden, the quiet halls of the mansion, into laboratories of strategy, teaching by example that the most unlikely instruments could be wielded with devastating effect. As the decades wore on, the story of Margaret of Baton Rouge became inseparable from the history of the city and the plantation culture she had quietly upended. Historians later would struggle to separate fact from legend, to trace the precise line between what she had done and how her reputation had grown. Yet the essence of her actions remained clear. She had demonstrated the fatal flaw of a system built on the assumption of invisibility and obedience. By mastering the tools provided to her, by observing and calculating, and by moving with patience and precision, she had transformed the powerless into instruments of influence, fear, and change. Visitors to the abandoned Beaumont mansion, years later, would speak of strange sensations in the air, a scent of herbs that seemed impossible, footsteps that vanished upon investigation, and a lingering presence that felt alive yet intangible. These were not merely ghost stories. They were echoes of Margaret's intellect, her determination, and her relentless pursuit of justice in a world that had sought to deny her any agency. The house itself, left to the elements, seemed infused with memory. The faint clatter of pots, the aroma of poisonous herbs, and the sense that someone who had once walked those halls could still be watching, still teaching, still reminding the living of the power hidden in plain sight. Margaret's legacy endured not in monuments or plaques, but in the quiet lessons passed from one generation to the next. Among those who survived the plantation system, her story was told as a symbol of resilience and intellect. It became a blueprint for subtle resistance, a testament to the ability of one determined individual to turn knowledge into strategy and grief into a weapon against oppression. She had shown that invisibility could be power, that patience could be as deadly as action, and that courage need not be loud to leave a permanent mark on history. And so, the woman who had been sold, who had been deprived of her children, and who had lived a life of subjugation became something far greater, a force, a legend, a teacher whose curriculum included lessons of survival and defiance that haunted, inspired, and transformed. Baton Rouge, the city that had once seen her, as just another servant, could never unsee her. The lives she touched, directly and indirectly, carried the memory of her brilliance and her courage. Her story became intertwined with the very identity of the region, a permanent reminder that the oppressed, when armed with knowledge, patience, and resolve, could turn invisibility into a weapon that reshaped the world around them. Margaret's ultimate fate remains a mystery. Some say she disappeared into the swamps and bayous of Louisiana, living out her days in careful secrecy. Others claim she passed into legend, becoming a figure whose influence was felt, but whose form was never seen again. What endures, however, is not the question of her survival, but the lesson she imparted. That power, intelligence, and courage do not always announce themselves, that invisibility can be the most formidable shield, and that the smallest, quietest figures can leave the largest marks on history. The Beaumont mansion stands empty today, but for those who enter, the faint aroma of exotic herbs, the whisper of footsteps, and the sense of deliberate, unseen presence serve as reminders of Margaret's enduring shadow, a shadow that is, at once, terror, instruction, and testament to the power of one woman to reshape the course of her world. Her story is more than history. It is a reminder, a warning, and an inspiration. It speaks to the enduring strength of intellect and patience, the necessity of resilience in the face of oppression, and the profound ways in which the invisible can become indelible. Margaret of Baton Rouge remains a figure whose presence transcends time, whose lessons echo through the centuries, and whose legacy is felt in every whispered tale of courage, subtle rebellion, and the quiet, unrelenting pursuit of justice.